Hey, good morning, Trondhjem friends, and welcome to this week's episode of Patio Ponderings. I'm Pastor Sue, and I'm so glad you decided to join me today. Today we continue our series on the Vocare Spiritual practice, which is the basis for our participation in the Nourishing Vocation Project. And as I did last week, I'm going to put a bunch of notes about all this underneath this video, so you'll be able to read a little bit more about that. So the Vocare Spiritual practice is an acrostic, and today we're on the O in Vocare, and the O stands for openness, which is my patio today, as I'm just kind of out in the open of this little field, this yard here today. So I just want to start today by sharing a little personal story. I think I did that last week too, but so the first time I ever had to get up and speak in front of a whole congregation during worship, it must have been about 15 years ago or so, not all that long ago in the whole scheme of things. All I had to do was get up for a minute and do like a little temple talk, a little announcement, if you will, about a ministry I was involved in. And I got up there, and all of a sudden I was so nervous. I had a hard time catching my breath. I was feeling shaky. I was a little worried I was just going to pass out. Things actually started to go a little gray around the edges, if you know what I mean. So a few years later, when I actually decided to go to seminary, you can maybe understand why I didn't feel like being a pastor was what I was truly called to. I felt like I was being open to God's call to go to seminary, but it was all about I loved the learning piece of it. I kind of imagined myself in a ministry leadership role, but I was not open to being a pastor. That I had blocked off entirely. That was not going to happen. It obviously, given that experience, was not for me. Sometimes we think we're being open, but we're not being entirely open to what God is calling us to be. And that's what has me thinking about our verse or our reading from Sunday, which is Ephesians chapter 1, in which the Apostle Paul is writing a beautiful kind of prayer and for this new church in Ephesus. And one of the verses, he says this: I pray that the eyes of your heart will have enough light to see what is the hope of God's call. So Paul is here praying for open eyes, but not physical eyes, but the eyes of our heart. And, that's a really hard thing to be entirely open, especially to what God calls us to be, because God can call us to some interesting and even crazy things. Being out in the open can make us feel vulnerable. It can force us to confront our fears, right? And it can really challenge us to imagine beyond where we are currently in terms of what we're comfortable with, what we feel capable of, what we're able to do. Being open requires, even in our deepest faith, requires a great deal of trust in God. And so I know even for me to be entirely open to taking on role of pastor, and boy, that took some doing to get to a place where I could do that. And I'll let you be the judge of how well I've done that or not. So yeah, openness is a mixed bag. We can feel like we're open. It's hard to be entirely open. But here's what I've been particularly wondering about and thinking about is this part in this verse about God's call, being open to God's call, and what is the hope of God's call. And I started to think about that. I think at first glance, we think of what we're hoping for, or hoping that God will give us what we need, will equip us to do whatever God calls us to do. But then I started to wonder about maybe it's God's hope for us. That in calling us to do things, God has incredible hope in what we will be able to accomplish, in the work that we will be able to do. And that's an interesting thing to that God has hope in us as well. So what do you think? Has there ever been a time when you've struggled to be open to what God is calling you to do? What has it taken for you to be fully open? And have you ever thought of God having hope in you and in your call to accomplish God's work here? Interesting things to think about. As always, would love to hear what you have to say. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you Sunday. Bye.